Hey, welcome in. Tonight, we're descending beneath the polished marble and echoing prayers of the Vatican into the shadowed vaults where the Church has locked away centuries of secrets. Not everything sacred is meant to be seen, and not every silence is holy. For over 1,200 years, this hidden archive has guarded knowledge, whispered scandals, forbidden texts, and truths that could change the story of the Church and maybe the story of the world. Some call it a library. Others call it a prison for ideas. Either way, what lies behind those locked doors is as powerful as it is mysterious. If you enjoy quietly unraveling the layers of history, not the clean version, but the real one, with all its dust, doubt, and buried wonder, then you're in the right place. Feel free to like or subscribe, but only if it truly feels right to you. And drop a comment, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Let's see where this quiet little journey takes us tonight. Lights low. Let's begin. The idea of a hidden Vatican library might sound like fiction, but it is very real. Officially called the Vatican Apostolic Archive, it was once known as the Vatican Secret Archive. That name alone has stirred imaginations for centuries. But in truth, the term secret comes from the Latin word secretum, which simply means private or personal. It referred to the Pope's private repository of documents, not a place of conspiracy or forbidden lore. Still, the secrecy surrounding this archive was very real and carefully guarded. For generations, the Church kept its contents entirely off limits to the outside world. Even the existence of the archive was rarely mentioned publicly until recent centuries. Locked away behind thick stone walls and heavy iron doors, the archive houses tens of thousands of manuscripts, letters, papal decrees, and coded documents. Many of these are written on fragile parchment, vellum, or aged paper, some bearing the marks of popes and monarchs long gone. There are ledgers, diaries, court proceedings, and handwritten records of decisions that shaped entire nations. For most of its existence, only a select few were ever allowed inside. The archive was considered the exclusive domain of the pontiff and his most trusted clerical aides. No scholars, researchers, or outsiders were permitted to even request a viewing. This secrecy gave rise to rumors and speculation, much of it fueled by the Church's immense political influence throughout the centuries. Some believe the archive holds lost scriptures or hidden knowledge that could challenge the official teachings of the Church. Others suspect it conceals the darkest moments in the Church's past, protected under lock and key. While some of that may be fiction, the archive's influence over history is very real and its origins deeply entwined with power. When the Vatican eventually allowed the world a glimpse into its hidden storehouse of knowledge, it was not out of a sudden desire for openness. For centuries, the archive had been closed to all but the inner circle of the Church. It was only in the late 19th century that limited access was granted, when Pope Leo XIII opened a portion of the collection to qualified scholars. Even then, access was carefully restricted. Researchers had to apply, prove their credentials, and request specific documents by title. They were not allowed to wander the stacks or browse through centuries of history. Instead, clerks would retrieve only the exact manuscript that had been approved, and the scholar was required to study it under supervision. This controlled opening was both a gesture of goodwill and a way to deflect growing criticism that the Church was hiding too much. It also reflected the Vatican's awareness that history, if left unexplored, could lead to damaging speculation. By providing selective access, the Church gave historians enough material to study papal diplomacy, church councils, and correspondence between rulers and popes, while still keeping the most sensitive texts safely out of reach. Even today, though more documents have been released, the archive remains closed in many respects. Entire sections are still off-limits, locked away under rules that only the Pope himself can change. This means that vast portions of history, potentially filled with revelations about religious disputes, political schemes, or lost works of literature, remain hidden. Scholars often describe the archive as both a treasure chest and a fortress, a place where the fate of knowledge itself is balanced between secrecy and revelation. To understand why the Vatican maintains such secrecy around its collection, one must consider what lies within. The archive is not just a library in the ordinary sense. It is a repository of original documents stretching back more than a millennium, chronicling moments that altered the course of Europe and beyond. Here are stored papal decrees that redrew borders, letters exchanged between popes and emperors that influenced wars, and transcripts of trials that decided the fate of scholars and heretics. One of the most famous is the document that officially split the world between Spain and Portugal during the Age of Exploration, a simple piece of parchment that changed the map of the globe. Another is the handwritten record of Galileo's trial before the Inquisition, a chilling reminder of the conflict between faith and scientific discovery. There are letters from monarchs pleading for annulments, petitions from kings demanding recognition, and reports from missionaries who wrote of lands unknown to Europe at the time. The archive preserves the words and decisions that shaped kingdoms, faiths, and civilizations. And yet, alongside the officially recognized documents, there are also records the Church would rather keep quiet evidence of corruption, political intrigue, and power struggles within its own hierarchy. The decision to guard these texts so closely was not only about preservation but also about control. To release everything without restriction would risk damaging the Church's authority, for history is often far messier than doctrine allows. This tension between preserving truth and controlling narrative has always been at the heart of the Vatican's approach to secrecy, ensuring that the archive remains both a place of knowledge and a place of silence. Access to the Vatican's hidden archive has always been tightly controlled, and even after it was partially opened, the rules remained strict. Not just anyone could apply. A researcher needed to prove academic standing, provide letters of recommendation, and make a detailed request for specific documents. General curiosity was never enough. Once inside, the rules continued. Only a limited number of manuscripts could be consulted each day, and no modern devices, such as scanners or cameras, were permitted. Notes were allowed, but copying documents word for word was restricted. Every page studied remained under the watchful eye of archivists trained to protect the fragile materials. This was not just about secrecy, but also about preservation. The parchment, vellum, and ink of centuries past are delicate, and careless handling could destroy irreplaceable records. Still, the level of restriction has always suggested that control is as important as conservation. Certain sections of the archive remain permanently closed, sealed to outsiders regardless of credentials. These are said to contain the most sensitive materials, documents so politically or theologically volatile that even the Church fears what they might reveal. Scholars speculate about hidden letters detailing papal corruption, long-suppressed texts from the early centuries of Christianity, or records of dealings with secret orders. Whether these theories are entirely accurate is impossible to confirm, because the locked doors of the archive rarely open wider than the Vatican chooses. The mystery of what remains forbidden is part of what gives the archive its aura, a reminder that the Church decides not only who may enter, but also what history may be known. The most significant shift in the secrecy of the Vatican's hidden library came when Pope Leo XIII made the decision to allow limited access. His choice was not without calculation. By the 19th century, the Church faced growing criticism that it was concealing truths of the past and standing in the way of modern scholarship. Opening the doors, even slightly, was meant to show confidence rather than weakness. Yet this opening was carefully staged. Scholars who were granted entry spoke of the overwhelming scale of the collection, with thousands of volumes stretching across miles of shelving. To them, it felt like standing inside the memory of Europe itself. They were stunned not just by the age of the documents, but by their sheer variety. Papal registers sat beside accounts of medieval councils, and diplomatic letters rested beside financial ledgers of the papal court. These glimpses confirmed that the archive was no simple library of theology, but a complete record of power, politics, and belief. Still, despite the appearance of transparency, the vast majority of materials remained untouched. Researchers could request specific documents, but only those that the Vatican was willing to produce. Entire categories were absent from any catalog and unavailable for consultation. For every record of a council or treaty revealed, countless others stayed behind sealed doors. Thus, the archive continued to serve a dual purpose. It was both a treasure chest of learning for those who entered and a wall of silence guarding the Vatican's most closely held secrets. To this day, the balance between what is shared and what is hidden continues to shape how the world views this most mysterious of collections. Among the many guarded corners of the Vatican's archive lies a collection that has stirred more unease than almost any other. This is the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. For centuries, this list determined what the faithful could and could not read. It was first created in response to the spread of ideas the Church considered dangerous, whether theological challenges, scientific claims, or political critiques. Once a work was placed on the index, possession of it could lead to serious consequences, ranging from excommunication to harsher punishments in earlier centuries. Some of the greatest minds in history found their works condemned. Philosophers, astronomers, and writers whose ideas are celebrated today were once branded as threats to the faith. The index did not merely ban books of witchcraft or heresy. It reached into the works of respected scholars whose findings contradicted official teaching. For generations, the faithful were told what knowledge they were permitted to seek and what ideas were to be shunned. Although the index was finally abolished in the 20th century, the records of its enforcement remain carefully preserved in the archive. There, scholars can find the lists of titles that were once forbidden, the names of authors condemned, and the reports of inquisitors who tracked the spread of banned works. To some, this represents an attempt by the Church to control not just faith, but thought itself. To others, it reflects the desire to protect doctrine from dangerous confusion. Whatever interpretation one accepts, the very existence of the index reminds us that the archive is not only a place of history, but also a monument to the struggle over knowledge and authority. Among the shelves of parchment and ink are letters that were never meant for public eyes. These private correspondences between popes and monarchs, emperors, generals, and even ordinary subjects tell stories far more human than the grand decrees carved into stone. In these pages, we find kings pleading for annulments, rulers seeking papal blessing for wars, and monarchs promising riches in exchange for influence. Some letters show deep respect and even desperation, as leaders turn to Rome for validation. Others reveal threats and bargains, where faith was less a matter of belief and more a tool of power. These hidden exchanges provide a view of history that is raw and unpolished. They expose the Church as not only a spiritual authority, but also the center of a global network of negotiation and control. In some cases, these letters shed light on crises that altered the fate of nations, from disputes over crowns to decisions that influenced entire empires. Yet just as important are the personal letters that reveal moments of weakness, regret, or ambition in voices we're used to hearing only through official records. For historians, these private correspondences are windows into the motives behind great events, a reminder that history was written not just in public acts, but in whispers exchanged in secrecy. That such letters remain locked away for centuries shows how sensitive they truly are, for they reveal that beneath the weight of theology and doctrine, the Vatican has always been deeply entangled in the politics of the world beyond its walls. Tucked within the collection are documents that deal not with kings or treaties, but with the supernatural. For centuries, the Church has kept detailed records of exorcisms, possessions, and the rituals used to confront what it believed were forces of darkness. These are not the sensational accounts of modern storytelling, but careful transcripts written by priests who claim to have witnessed extraordinary struggles between faith and something they could not explain. Some describe individuals speaking in languages they never learned. Others record voices and behaviors that those present swore were not human. Alongside these testimonies are the prayers, invocations, and rites used in attempts to drive such spirits away. These texts reveal that for the Vatican, the unseen world was never dismissed lightly. The records also include manuals written for clerics on how to identify true possession versus illness or deception, showing that the Church was both cautious and fearful of being deceived. Yet the very act of preserving these accounts demonstrates that the Vatican believed such encounters were genuine enough to merit documentation. To read these passages is to see how medieval and early modern minds understood the boundary between the divine and the demonic, though today many would interpret these experiences differently. Within the archive, they remain as reminders of an age when the supernatural was woven into daily life. The secrecy around these texts reflects both the Church's desire to control the narrative of spiritual warfare and its awareness that such material, if misunderstood, could inspire fear or misuse. These hidden records whisper of a world where even the strongest institutions acknowledged that unseen battles were fought alongside the visible struggles of history. Few stories from the archive inspire as much speculation as the records concerning the Knights Templar. Once hailed as defenders of pilgrims and guardians of the Holy Land, the Templars fell swiftly from grace when they were accused of heresy, corruption, and secret practices. Arrested on the orders of the French king and condemned with the support of the papacy, many were imprisoned, tortured, and executed. For centuries, the details of their trials remained hidden, fueling legends that the Vatican suppressed the truth of their confessions. Were they guilty of the charges, or were they sacrificed to political convenience and royal greed? Within the Vatican's collection lies the Chinon parchment, a document that resurfaced only in the early years of this century. It reveals that a pope at the time had in fact absolved the Templar leaders of heresy, though the order was still dissolved under immense pressure from secular rulers. This single discovery shifted the narrative, showing how power and politics shaped their downfall more than faith. Yet beyond this document are hints of further testimonies, transcripts, and possibly records of treasures or knowledge the Templars were believed to have possessed. Whether those records confirm the myths of hidden relics or simply expose the machinery of medieval power, they remain a reminder that the Vatican's archives are not passive collections of history. They are active participants in shaping what we are permitted to remember and what remains buried in silence. The story of the Templars demonstrates how a single hidden document can alter the way we understand an entire chapter of the past. One of the most haunting treasures of the Vatican Archive is the record of Galileo Galilei's trial before the Inquisition. The scientist who turned his telescope to the heavens and declared that the earth moved around the sun became a threat, not because of his instruments, but because his discoveries challenged established doctrine. The Church feared that if the heavens did not align with Scripture, its authority would be shaken. In the trial documents, which remain preserved in the archive, we see the full weight of the Inquisition bearing down on one man. Galileo defended his observations with reason and evidence, but his judges demanded obedience. Under threat of torture, he was forced to recant his findings, declaring what he knew to be true as false. These records capture not just the struggle of science against tradition, but also the heavy silence imposed upon inquiry when it opposed power. For centuries, the Vatican kept these papers under strict control, allowing only whispers of what had transpired. It was not until modern times that the Church publicly acknowledged its error in condemning Galileo. Yet the fragile pages of his trial remain as testimony to an era when curiosity could be a crime, and knowledge itself was placed on trial. They remind us that the archive holds not only triumphs of faith, but also its darkest reckonings, when the guardians of truth fear the light of discovery more than the shadows of ignorance. To read Galileo's words, crossed and corrected under command, is to hear a voice straining against the silence that history tried to impose. Among the whispers that echo through the Vatican's hidden vaults is the question of the missing Gospels. The New Testament, as we know it, was carefully chosen from a much wider body of writings produced in the first centuries after the life of Jesus. Some texts were accepted into the canon, others were condemned as apocryphal, and many simply vanished. Yet in the archive, there are references and fragments that suggest certain Gospels did not disappear entirely. These include accounts that present different versions of familiar events or teachings, and some that suggest new episodes altogether. Early Christian communities were far from unified, and their writings reflected conflicting interpretations of who Jesus was and what his message meant. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and other suppressed works once circulated among believers, only to be denounced as heresy. Some of these writings have resurfaced in modern times through archaeological discoveries, but others are known only through mentions in church documents that remain locked away. For the Vatican, preserving these texts without releasing them may have been a way of safeguarding history while preventing theological confusion. Yet, the very act of hiding them raises questions. What was so dangerous in these words that they had to be silenced for centuries? Did they simply fail to align with doctrine? Or did they challenge fundamental ideas about authority, salvation, or the role of women in the early church? The archive's quiet custody of these suppressed gospels is perhaps one of its most compelling mysteries. It reminds us that Scripture is not only a matter of faith, but also the product of choices, decisions made by men, who determined what the faithful would be allowed to read and what would be left to gather dust in silence. The question of the Vatican's actions during the Second World War has long been a subject of fierce debate, and the answers lie buried within its archive. At the heart of the controversy is Pope Pius XII, a man whose role in one of history's darkest chapters remains unsettled. Some see him as cautious and silent, a pontiff who failed to use his immense influence to condemn the atrocities unfolding across Europe. Others argue that he worked behind the scenes, attempting to protect lives while avoiding direct confrontation with brutal regimes. The archive holds correspondence, diplomatic cables, and reports that reveal the Vatican's position in real time as the war advanced. These documents include messages from bishops pleading for guidance, accounts from nuncios stationed in occupied territories, and memoranda about how far the Church should go in confronting injustice. In recent years, portions of these wartime records have been opened, allowing historians their first close look. They confirm the delicate balancing act that defined papacy during the conflict, condemnations muted, diplomacy cautious, and humanitarian work carried out quietly through monasteries, convents, and local clergy. Yet they also expose moments when silence weighed heavily, when stronger words might have altered perception, if not events. The debate is unlikely ever to be settled fully, but the archive makes clear that the Vatican was deeply entangled in the moral and political dilemmas of the age. These files remind us that secrecy can protect reputation as much as truth, and that the Church, like any institution, struggled with fear, caution, and compromise. In the face of overwhelming darkness, among the more enduring mysteries said to lie within the Vatican's archive are maps that suggest the world was known in ways long before it was thought to be. The official story of discovery credits European explorers with first charting the Americas, yet rumors persist that records within the Vatican hint at earlier knowledge. Some scholars have suggested that ancient maps preserved by the Church depict lands across the ocean well before the voyages that reshaped history. Whether these maps were passed down from antiquity, inherited from lost libraries such as Alexandria, or gathered by the hands of medieval travelers, their very existence would challenge accepted narratives. There are claims that seafaring orders like the Templars may have reached far shores, and that their findings were quietly absorbed into the Vatican's collection. Even if these stories lean more toward legend than fact, the presence of navigational charts, missionary reports, and travelers' accounts within the archive is undeniable. These materials demonstrate the Vatican's role as a global information hub, collecting knowledge from every corner of the known world. The secrecy surrounding such maps may have less to do with conspiracy and more with the way history is written, favoring certain narratives over others. Yet the idea that the Church holds documents showing awareness of distant lands before the official age of exploration continues to fuel speculation. Whether true or not, the archive certainly contains countless accounts of journeys, encounters, and discoveries that remain unseen by the public. In this sense, the locked drawers of the Vatican may hold not just the past of Europe, but traces of the wider world, mapped and recorded long before we are taught it was known. Among the oldest manuscripts stored in the Vatican Archive are works that carry faint traces of resistance against authority. These are not polished gospels or papal decrees, but notes scribbled in margins, small insertions by scribes or scholars who dared to record doubts, criticisms, or alternative interpretations. In some cases, the marginal notes contradict the main text, hinting at theological debates that raged beneath the surface of official teaching. Others suggest knowledge of ideas considered dangerous at the time, references to classical philosophy, or even observations about nature that conflicted with doctrine. The Church called these heresies, but to the scribes who penned them, they may have been attempts to preserve insights they feared would otherwise vanish. These little fragments, sometimes just a word or phrase, reveal the human element within the great machinery of faith. They show that even as the Church sought to control knowledge, individuals within its own ranks questioned, doubted, and recorded what they saw or believed. The secrecy surrounding these annotations is understandable, for to acknowledge them would be to admit that dissent was present even within the heart of the Church. Some were erased, scraped away from parchment, but faint outlines remain visible to modern eyes. To study them is to sense the quiet courage of those who refuse to let questions be silenced entirely. The Vatican's decision to preserve such texts without publicizing them reflects a tension it has long carried, balancing the preservation of history with a fear of undermining authority. These faint scribbles, hidden for centuries, remind us that history is never as unified as it appears, and that truth often survives in the smallest of details. Among the artistic treasures connected to the Vatican, few figures stand taller than Michelangelo. His work in the Sistine Chapel is celebrated as one of the greatest achievements of human creativity. But within the Vatican Archive lie the letters, sketches, and notes that reveal a more complicated relationship between artist and church. Michelangelo was not merely a willing servant of papal commissions. He was also a man who struggled with the demands placed upon him, the politics of Rome, and his own vision of faith and beauty. His correspondence with popes and cardinals shows the tension between artistic freedom and religious authority. Some letters speak of delays, disputes over payment, and frustration at the endless pressures of his task. Others hint at his quiet resistance, embedding subtle messages and layered symbolism within his work. For centuries, whispers have suggested that certain images on the ceiling and altar may have carried hidden critiques, veiled commentaries on the corruption and ambition Michelangelo witnessed within the Vatican itself. Whether deliberate or not, the documents preserved in the archive capture the voice of an artist caught between genius and obligation, between inspiration and the demands of power. These records remind us that even in an age when the Church commanded the greatest talents of the world, it could not fully control what those talents chose to express. The Sistine ceiling may stand as a triumph of papal patronage, but the letters and sketches tucked away in the archive show the private battles behind the public masterpiece. They reveal Michelangelo as both servant and rebel, a man who painted divinity on stone while quietly wrestling with the flaws of those who claimed to speak for heaven. Take a breath. We've only scratched the surface. Subscribe to keep uncovering what's hidden. Beneath the image of the Vatican as a purely spiritual center lies a history of strategy, coded letters, and intelligence gathering. The archive preserves evidence of what can only be described as a papal network of spies and informants. From the Renaissance onward, the Vatican operated not just as a religious power, but as a diplomatic player with eyes and ears in courts across Europe. Envoys reported back with details of treaties, marriages, betrayals, and military campaigns. Some letters were written in code, their meanings hidden beneath layers of symbols and ciphers, ensuring that only trusted clerics could interpret them. This web of intelligence allowed the papacy to anticipate threats, influence alliances, and maintain leverage over kings and princes. At times, the Vatican acted as mediator, at other times as manipulator, pulling strings behind events that altered the balance of power. The documents reveal how knowledge was as valuable as armies, and how the Church understood that information could shape the fate of nations. Though the Vatican has always portrayed itself as a moral guide above worldly schemes, these records show it was also deeply entrenched in the practical business of survival. The secrecy surrounding this correspondence continues to spark speculation. For if the archive holds the details of centuries of espionage, then it holds a parallel history of Europe itself. These documents remind us that faith and politics have never been separate, and that behind the walls of the Vatican, strategy was written in ink as carefully as sermons were spoken from pulpits. In its archive, the Vatican carries not just the memory of prayer, but also the footprints of a shadow network that once reached across the world. Hidden in the Vatican archive are manuscripts that describe rituals no longer spoken of in churches, rites that once shaped the daily spiritual life of believers, but which have since been set aside, forgotten, or deliberately silenced. These include early prayers of protection, elaborate blessings for fields and harvests, and even invocations that border on what today might be considered magical practice. Some texts outline ceremonies meant to ward off plague, storms, or misfortune, blending Christian devotion with older traditions inherited from antiquity. Others contain rites of purification and exorcism more detailed than those now officially sanctioned, suggesting that the Church once held a far broader set of tools for engaging with the unseen world. The presence of these manuscripts in the archive demonstrates how fluid and experimental faith could be before doctrine solidified into rigid boundaries. Over time, many of these practices were suppressed, condemned as superstition or pagan influence, and were struck from official liturgy. Yet the Vatican preserved them, perhaps recognizing their historical value, or perhaps fearing the consequences of destroying records so closely tied to the evolution of Christian worship. Reading these rituals today provides a rare glimpse into a time when the line between prayer and spell, between blessing and incantation, was far less defined than we imagine. Their secrecy reflects the Church's awareness that such practices, if revealed, could challenge the image of purity and consistency it prefers to project. Locked in the archive, these forgotten rites remain a reminder that the history of worship is not one of perfect continuity, but of change, suppression, and survival in the margins of sacred memory. The Vatican's hidden library also holds the stories of saints who were quietly removed from memory, figures once venerated, but later silenced by the very institution that had celebrated them. In the early centuries of Christianity, sainthood was not always formally regulated. Local communities would revere holy men and women, often elevating them through popular devotion long before Rome offered recognition. As the Church grew in authority, it began to control who could be called a saint, and in some cases, those once honored were struck from the calendar. Their names, prayers, and relics were removed from official liturgy, leaving only faint traces in manuscripts preserved in the archive. Some were excluded because their lives were judged to have been exaggerated or based on legend rather than fact. Others were silenced because their teachings clashed with doctrine, or their cults became too closely tied to local politics. These forgotten saints remind us that memory itself is shaped by power, and that holiness could be celebrated or erased depending on the needs of the institution. Within the archive are hagiographies that no longer appear in church books, letters praising men and women once revered, and papal decrees quietly suppressing their names. For historians, these documents show how the idea of sanctity was never fixed, but contested and revised across time. To uncover them is to discover a shadowed procession of holy figures once carried in prayer by entire communities, now relegated to silence. The Vatican's decision to keep these records rather than destroy them demonstrates a paradox. Even as it sought to erase them from worship, it preserved their memory in secret, where they still wait, unread and unknown. Among the most infamous families to ever occupy the papal throne were the Borgias, and within the Vatican Archive lie documents that still whisper of their notoriety. Rodrigo Borgia, who became Pope Alexander VI, is remembered as one of the most scandalous figures in church history, accused of nepotism, debauchery, and ruthless politics. Much of what we know about him comes from hostile sources, but the archive preserves official records that survived his reign. These include letters granting favors to relatives, financial accounts showing vast sums moving to enrich his family, and reports of alliances struck with the powerful families of Italy. There are even references to the notorious banquets and feasts he presided over, events that became legendary for their excess. Rumors of poisonings and assassinations have always clung to the Borgias, and though not all can be proven, the preserved records reveal a papacy deeply entangled in the pursuit of worldly power. They show how positions within the church were sold, how enemies were neutralized, and how the Vatican itself became a stage for dynastic ambition. Yet alongside the darker documents are also traces of genuine administrative ability. Alexander strengthened certain papal holdings and acted as a skilled politician, but the shadow of corruption looms far larger than his achievements. The secrecy surrounding these papers reflects the Church's discomfort with this legacy. For while many other scandalous records were destroyed, the Borgias' imprint was too deeply etched into history to erase. Instead, their story sits preserved in silence, a reminder of how even the holiest office in Christendom was once treated as a throne of worldly power, secured through cunning, indulgence, and fear. Within the Vatican's hidden halls, scholars whisper of a room with no name, a chamber absent from official guides and uncatalogued in public records. Those who have worked within the archive speak of sealed doors that are never opened for visiting researchers, doors without identifying marks, behind which the contents remain a mystery. Some believe these hidden rooms contain collections deemed too dangerous or controversial to be listed, perhaps correspondence that could undermine long-held narratives or evidence of alliances that the Church prefers to leave in shadow. Others suggest that such spaces are used for preservation, storing fragile texts that would crumble if exposed to light or careless handling. Still, the lack of acknowledgement only deepens curiosity. In an institution built upon order and meticulous record-keeping, the absence of a name raises more questions than answers. The archive is a labyrinth, stretching across miles of shelves, and secrecy here is deliberate rather than accidental. Rumors persist of documents concerning suppressed gospels, sealed papal orders, or even ancient manuscripts rescued from the ruins of empires long gone. Whether truth or exaggeration, the existence of such a nameless room embodies the spirit of the archive itself, a place where knowledge is both preserved and withheld. For every item carefully catalogued and offered to scholars, there may be another that remains hidden behind an unmarked door, locked away for reasons known only to those entrusted with the keys. The room with no name has become more than a space. It is a symbol of what the Vatican chooses not to reveal, a reminder that some histories remain concealed, not because they are lost, but because they are kept in silence. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Vatican Archive is its vast collection of diplomatic correspondence. For centuries, papal envoys, known as nuncios, were stationed across Europe and beyond, acting as both ambassadors and informants. They sent back detailed reports of political shifts, royal disputes, and the private lives of rulers. These letters formed a steady stream of intelligence that allowed the Vatican to anticipate wars, influence peace treaties, and maintain its role as mediator in disputes that crossed borders and faiths. Reading these accounts is like stepping into the hidden councils of kings and emperors, for the nuncios often reported what was whispered in private chambers rather than what was proclaimed in public. Some of these documents reveal secret alliances, others expose betrayals, and many record the uneasy balance between spiritual authority and worldly ambition. They also show how the Vatican positioned itself as a power broker, using persuasion, pressure, and promises to shape events far beyond the walls of Rome. In some cases, the correspondence suggests that the Church knew of crises long before they erupted, but chose silence until the moment was right to act. The archive's preservation of these letters offers a parallel history of Europe, one written not in battles and treaties but in ink and parchment, crafted by those whose task was to watch, listen, and record. Yet, access to this material remains selective, and much of it is still hidden, a reminder that the Vatican has always understood that information is as potent a weapon as armies or gold. Among the most carefully guarded manuscripts in the Vatican Archive are those connected to the Council of Nicaea, the pivotal gathering where bishops sought to unify Christian teaching. While much of what is known comes from official records and later accounts, the archive holds early transcripts and drafts that reveal how fragile consensus truly was. These documents show heated debates over the nature of Christ, the meaning of salvation, and the authority of Scripture itself. Far from being a simple declaration of faith, the council was a battle of ideas, shaped as much by politics as by theology. Emperors pressed for unity to stabilize their realms, while bishops argued fiercely over which texts and traditions should define the faith. The archive's hidden records remind us that the decisions made were not inevitable but chosen, often by narrow margins, with competing voices silenced once the creed was established. Some manuscripts even hint at teachings that were considered but rejected, fragments of belief that would later be condemned as heresy. The secrecy around these documents reflects the Church's long-standing desire to present its doctrine as timeless and unbroken, when in reality it was forged in conflict and compromise. To glimpse these early debates is to see Christianity not as a single voice, but as a chorus of competing visions, many of which were lost once the Council declared its final word. Preserved in silence, these manuscripts reveal how the Church's foundation was not carved in certainty, but negotiated in tension, shaped as much by human need as by divine inspiration. Among the long shelves of papal records lie documents that shed light on the inquisitions, a series of tribunals that sought to defend faith by rooting out heresy. The archive preserves trial transcripts, accusations, and confessions, some extracted under duress, that reveal how ordinary men and women were swept into a system where belief itself could be questioned. These records describe lives upended by suspicion, neighbors turning against each other, and communities fractured by fear. They also show the meticulous care with which inquisitors documented proceedings, leaving behind an almost clinical record of spiritual policing. Within these pages, one can find the voices of scholars condemned for questioning doctrine, mystics accused of false visions, and common people tried for superstitions that clashed with official teaching. While the Church framed these actions as defense of truth, the archive shows how easily the pursuit of orthodoxy could slide into control and intimidation. Some documents reveal moments of mercy when accused individuals were quietly released or reconciled, but many more end with punishments designed to instill fear. For centuries, these trials were spoken of only in whispers, their full scope hidden from public view. By preserving the records but keeping them sealed for so long, the Vatican ensured that the story of the Inquisitions was shaped more by silence than by open examination. To read them today is to hear not only the voice of authority, but also the voices of the silenced, testimonies that speak of faith, doubt, and survival under the weight of power. These records remain one of the most unsettling reminders that the Vatican's archive contains not just theology, but the raw evidence of control exercised in the name of belief. The Vatican Archive also houses correspondence and reports that reveal the Church's uneasy relationship with scientific progress. Long before Galileo faced his trial, other thinkers had already brushed against the boundaries of what was permissible to question. Records describe scholars who studied medicine, astronomy, and natural philosophy, only to find their findings scrutinized by those who feared that discovery could undermine doctrine. Some documents show genuine curiosity from churchmen who sought to understand new ideas, while others reveal suspicion and warnings to halt research that strayed too far. In the archive are letters from early physicians describing the circulation of blood, accounts from astronomers who charted the stars in patterns contradicting traditional cosmology, and treatises that blended faith with reason in ways later judged dangerous. These texts were often copied and preserved, but access was restricted, and many works were placed on lists of forbidden books. The archive became both a guardian of knowledge and a gatekeeper, ensuring that science survived, but under the watchful eye of theology. The preservation of these manuscripts is striking, for it shows that even as the Church resisted certain discoveries publicly, it never allowed them to vanish entirely. Instead, they were kept in silence, studied in secret, and locked away from broader debate. Today, those manuscripts remind us that the boundary between faith and science was never clear, and that progress often advanced quietly, hidden beneath layers of secrecy. The Vatican's role in this tension is one of paradox, both suppressing and safeguarding, resisting the light of inquiry while ensuring that its glow was never fully extinguished. The archive contains not only theological debates and scientific disputes, but also the daily workings of the medieval and Renaissance Church, captured in account books, inventories, and financial ledgers. These documents reveal the immense wealth that flowed through the Vatican's coffers and the ways it was spent to maintain power. Recorded with precision are the donations of kings and nobles, the rents from church lands, the costs of military campaigns, and the payments for artists and architects who adorned Rome with masterpieces. Alongside these figures are notes on loans, debts, and agreements with bankers who financed the ambitions of popes. Some records show extravagant feasts and celebrations that drained resources, while others detail emergency levies imposed during wars or crises. To read these ledgers is to see the Vatican not only as a spiritual authority, but also as a political and economic empire. These pages remind us that the Church was a landowner, a patron, and at times even a creditor, its wealth extending across Europe. The secrecy of these financial records reflects how closely money and morality were intertwined, for while the Church preached humility and sacrifice, its own accounts revealed immense riches and costly indulgence. Preserved in silence, these ledgers provide a candid view of the Vatican's worldly concerns, exposing the tension between its divine image and its material reality. They remind us that behind every gilded chapel and painted ceiling were coins exchanged, debts collected, and fortunes built, all carefully recorded by clerks whose work now rests locked away on brittle parchment. Let that one sink in. When you're ready for the next mystery, hit subscribe. Among the documents that rest within the Vatican's hidden archive are papal bulls and decrees that once reshaped entire societies. A papal bull was more than a proclamation. It carried the authority of the pontiff, as if it were spoken with the weight of heaven itself. Some bulls granted kings the right to rule, others launched crusades that sent thousands across continents, and still others divided lands between empires. These decrees were copied, sealed, and dispatched across Europe, altering borders and legitimizing wars. The archive holds the original copies, often bearing wax seals and elaborate calligraphy, preserved like artifacts of power. Reading them reveals how a single document could decide the fate of nations and generations. Some bulls called for reform within the Church, demanding stricter discipline from clergy, while others offered indulgences in exchange for loyalty and wealth. There are also decrees that now appear deeply troubling, such as those that justified conquest and colonization, framing domination as a sacred mission. The Vatican kept these documents because they defined its authority, but their secrecy also shields the Church from criticism, for each bull shows how theology was intertwined with politics and ambition. These preserved proclamations remind us that paper and ink can wield as much influence as sword and shield, carrying decisions that rippled far beyond the walls of Rome. To study them is to see how the Vatican's word once reached into every corner of Christendom, shaping history not only through faith but through the absolute assertion of power. In the quiet corners of the archive rest chronicles of the Crusades, written not by soldiers but by papal scribes and envoys, who documented the calls to arms, the flow of money, and the tangled diplomacy behind the wars. These records show how the crusading spirit was stirred not only through sermons, but through meticulous planning, letters urging rulers to contribute men and treasure, and papal decrees promising salvation in exchange for service. The archive preserves the correspondence between popes and monarchs as they negotiated who would lead, who would finance, and who would reap the spoils. Reports from returning envoys describe victories celebrated and defeats explained away, revealing how the Vatican shaped the narrative for the faithful. Some documents record the pledges of knights who vowed to take the cross, their names inscribed like signatures of destiny. Others describe the transport of relics and the establishment of new dioceses in conquered lands. These manuscripts remind us that the Crusades were not spontaneous outbursts of piety, but carefully orchestrated campaigns, driven as much by politics and wealth as by devotion. The secrecy surrounding these records reflects the contradictions of the crusading era. For while the Vatican portrayed the wars as holy missions, the documents reveal the compromises, betrayals, and worldly interests that underpin them. Preserved in silence, they show the clash between the image of righteous war and the reality of ambition, reminding us that faith has often marched hand in hand with power. Among the most delicate collections preserved in the Vatican Archive are reports from missionaries who journeyed across oceans to distant lands. These accounts, sent back to Rome, described cultures, traditions, and beliefs encountered in places that were new to European eyes. Missionaries wrote of kingdoms in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, recording everything from languages and rituals to the political structures of rulers they met. Some accounts were filled with admiration for the wisdom and resilience of the people they encountered, while others judged them harshly through the lens of Christian doctrine. The archive also contains letters describing the hardships of mission life, illness, hunger, isolation, and sometimes violent resistance from those who rejected conversion. In these reports, we also glimpse the beginnings of cultural exchange, where new foods, medicines, and ideas were first described to Europe. Yet alongside the genuine curiosity and courage of missionaries lies the shadow of conquest, for these accounts often went hand in hand with colonial expansion. Rome's knowledge of distant lands became a tool of both faith and empire, shaping how Europe approached the wider world. Preserved in secrecy, these reports show how the Church became a global observer long before modern exploration is said to have mapped the world. They remind us that the Vatican's hidden archive does not contain only theological debates, but also the earliest European descriptions of peoples and places whose histories were forever altered by those encounters. Locked away, these letters are more than records. They are windows into first meetings that changed the course of entire civilizations. Deep within the archive are transcripts of witch trials that swept across Europe during the late medieval and early modern period. These documents capture the fear and suspicion that gripped entire communities, where misfortune or illness was often blamed on the workings of sorcery. The records include accusations, testimonies, and confessions, many of them extracted under torture, that painted ordinary men and women as servants of the devil. Reading these pages reveals how fragile life was under such suspicion, for a neighbor's word or a quarrel could be enough to condemn. Some cases involved elaborate claims of secret gatherings, spells, or pacts with dark powers, descriptions that reveal more about the anxieties of the age than about the accused themselves. The Vatican preserved these records as part of its effort to maintain oversight of orthodoxy, ensuring that inquisitors acted within bounds, though the very existence of such trials shows how far fear could reach. The secrecy around these manuscripts reflects the Church's awareness of the cruelty and injustice that often accompanied the pursuit of witches. They are reminders that faith, when mixed with fear, can be turned against the very people it seeks to guide. Yet within these grim pages also lie traces of resilience. Some accused refused to confess. Others clung to their faith, even as judgment fell upon them. Locked away, the trial documents reveal the cost of superstition and authority intertwined, exposing how belief, fear, and power could converge in ways that scarred entire generations. The archive's silence on these matters only deepens the haunting weight of the words still written on its fragile pages. The Vatican Archive also preserves records of plagues and famines that ravaged Europe, documents that reveal not only the suffering of ordinary people, but also the Church's struggle to respond. These accounts include letters from bishops describing cities emptied by disease, villages abandoned, and fields left untended. Priests wrote of entire congregations lost, of processions carried out in hope of divine mercy, and of the desperate search for explanations. In some records, the Church sought to interpret such calamities as punishment for sin, while in others, there are signs of compassion and practical care, with monasteries distributing food and shelter. The archive also contains reports from physicians and clerics who observed the symptoms of disease, sometimes noting patterns of contagion that hint at an early awareness of causes not yet understood. Alongside these accounts are papal decrees adjusting fasts, indulgences, and burial practices in response to overwhelming death. Reading these documents reminds us that the Vatican was both a spiritual authority and an administrative power tasked with guiding millions through crises that seemed beyond human control. Yet the secrecy around these manuscripts also reflects the Church's unease at its inability to prevent catastrophe, for plagues often raised questions about divine protection and the limits of prayer. These records stand as a testimony not only to suffering, but to resilience, showing how faith was both shaken and deepened in the shadow of disaster. Preserved in silence, they tell the story of how humanity turned to belief in its darkest hours, and how the Church sought to hold together a world that seemed to be unraveling. Among the parchments stored in the Vatican's hidden vaults are records of astronomical events that startled entire generations. Chroniclers carefully noted comets blazing across the sky, eclipses that turned day into sudden night, and strange lights that inspired awe and fear in equal measure. These accounts were more than observations. They were often framed as omens, signs of divine warning or approval, shaping how rulers and common people alike interpreted the course of history. The archive preserves letters from bishops who reported such events to Rome, sometimes in tones of alarm, urging the papacy to declare their meaning. Others wrote with curiosity, describing the size, color, and movement of celestial phenomena in ways that echo scientific observation. Some manuscripts even show attempts to calculate cycles and predict when such wonders might return. Yet behind these efforts lay tension, for astronomy walked a fine line between faith and forbidden inquiry. The Church was cautious about how much of the heavens could be studied without threatening doctrine, and so many of these records were kept hidden rather than shared. They reveal a world where the sky itself was a message board, read with reverence and dread. Preserved in secrecy, these writings show that the Vatican was not blind to the wonders above, but sought to control how they were understood. To read them today is to glimpse the moment when the heavens were shifting from a realm of mystery and divine signs to one of measurable science, with the Church caught between wonder, caution, and fear of losing authority. Within the archive also lie fragile manuscripts connected to the Library of Alexandria, or at least to works that may have once passed through it. Scholars in Rome during late antiquity are known to have copied Greek and Egyptian texts, and some of those translations appear to survive in the Vatican's care. They include fragments of philosophical treatises, mathematical writings, and texts on medicine that echo voices of thinkers long vanished. Whether they were rescued before Alexandria's decline or arrived later through trade and conquest, their preservation in Rome suggests that the Church quietly inherited more than just Christian writings. These manuscripts reveal a continuity of knowledge, a thread linking the wisdom of ancient civilizations to the scholars of the Middle Ages. Yet their secrecy reflects caution, for many of these texts contain ideas that did not align with Christian teaching. Some describe cycles of the cosmos, theories of creation that differ from Scripture, or practices of healing that drew from pagan rituals. By keeping them locked away, the Church ensured that they survived while limiting who could access them. To uncover such writings is to glimpse a world where philosophy, science, and faith once mingled freely before being divided into sacred and forbidden. The very survival of these manuscripts demonstrates that destruction is rarely complete, and that knowledge has a way of lingering in unexpected places. In the Vatican's archive, fragments of antiquity still whisper from parchment, carrying echoes of fires long extinguished and libraries long lost, a reminder that history is not only what survives in light, but what endures in silence. Among the most unsettling texts preserved in the Vatican archive are grim records of torture and punishment, written not as stories but as official proceedings. These documents detail the methods used during inquisitions and trials, where confessions were sought at any cost. Clerks carefully recorded the tools employed, the stages of questioning, and the words spoken by the accused, often under unbearable duress. Some testimonies read like cries for mercy, while others reveal the silence of those who refuse to betray their beliefs. To read these accounts is to encounter the raw machinery of control, where faith and fear became instruments of authority. The Vatican did not destroy these records, perhaps because they were seen as proof of duty carried out in defense of orthodoxy, but their secrecy speaks to the discomfort they evoke. Preserved but hidden, they expose a contradiction within the Church. The same institution that preached compassion also sanctioned cruelty in the name of salvation. These texts remind us that history is not only a record of triumphs and devotion, but also of shadows cast by power. They also show the endurance of the human spirit. For some refused to yield even when faced with unbearable suffering. The silence surrounding these manuscripts is telling, for to bring them fully to light would be to confront a legacy of fear that shaped countless lives. Locked in the archive, these pages remain as stark evidence of the cost of enforcing faith with violence, a truth that lingers quietly within the walls of Rome. Not all of the Vatican's hidden manuscripts deal with punishment or politics. Some preserve knowledge of medicine and healing gathered over centuries. These texts include remedies copied from Greek and Roman sources, treatises on herbs and their properties, and instructions for treatments that blend faith with practical care. Monastic communities often served as centers of healing, and the records they produced eventually made their way into the Vatican's custody. Some describe the use of plants still valued in modern medicine, while others prescribe rituals and prayers alongside poultices and tonics. The manuscripts reveal how medicine was never separate from faith, with healing seen as both a spiritual and physical act. Yet secrecy surrounded many of these writings, especially those that drew heavily from pagan traditions or suggested natural causes for ailments, once thought to be divine punishment. By preserving them without wide circulation, the Vatican ensured that knowledge was not lost while maintaining control over how it was applied. In these texts, we see a picture of a world where priests served as both spiritual guides and healers, tending not just to the soul, but to the body. They also reflect the limits of their time, with treatments that today might seem ineffective or even harmful, standing alongside insights that foreshadow modern discoveries. Hidden away, these manuscripts remind us that the history of healing is not linear, but layered with faith, fear, and fragile experiment. Their survival within the Vatican's walls shows that even in an age dominated by doctrine, the search for ways to ease suffering was never abandoned, only carefully guarded. Among the manuscripts sealed within the Vatican Archive are chronicles of natural disasters that shook Europe and beyond. Reports from bishops and priests describe earthquakes that toppled cities, floods that swallowed farmland, and volcanic eruptions that darkened the skies. These accounts were often framed as warnings from heaven, urging repentance and devotion. Yet they also serve as valuable records of how communities experienced catastrophe. The documents reveal how people sought meaning in calamity, gathering in processions, fasting, or erecting shrines in hopes of divine mercy. Some chronicles describe entire towns emptied, while others tell of miraculous survivals that were attributed to the protection of saints. Beyond their spiritual tone, these manuscripts also offer glimpses of early observation, noting patterns of weather, the effects of famine, and the spread of disease in the aftermath of disaster. Preserved in silence, they show that the Vatican was not only a custodian of faith, but also a collector of human experience, recording how people endured the raw forces of nature. The secrecy around such texts may stem from the way they challenge certainty, for if disasters could strike without warning or reason, what did that say about divine order? Yet the Church chose not to destroy them, perhaps recognizing their value as both testimony and warning. These manuscripts remain as reminders that faith has always been tested, not only by human conflict, but also by the relentless power of the earth itself, forces that humbled even the greatest empires and drove people to seek meaning in the shadows of ruin. A pause is good, but the secrets don't stop here. Subscribe and stay close. The Vatican Archive also shelters documents concerning exorcisms and accounts of possession, texts that reveal how the Church confronted what it believed to be the presence of evil in the world. These records include prayers, instructions for rituals, and testimonies of cases where individuals were thought to be under the influence of dark forces. Priests described violent fits, strange voices, and uncanny knowledge, details written with solemn care as evidence of the struggle between light and shadow. Some manuscripts recount successful exorcisms, where the afflicted were said to be freed after long sessions of prayer, fasting, and the use of holy water or relics. Others record failures or cases where suffering continued despite every effort. These accounts remind us that the Church saw itself not only as guardian of souls, but also as a warrior against invisible enemies. Secrecy around such texts was inevitable, for while they offered a window into belief, they also risked fueling superstition or inspiring practices the Church preferred to regulate tightly. Some of the rituals preserved bear marks of older traditions, blending Christian invocation with gestures that echo ancient rites. To read them is to glimpse a time when the unseen world was felt to be dangerously close, and when the Vatican's role included mediating between heaven and forces thought to dwell in darkness. Locked away, these manuscripts remain as unsettling testimony, not simply of possession, but of the fears, hopes, and desperate prayers of people who believe themselves caught between two realms. They stand as reminders that the archive holds not only history, but also the echoes of battles fought in silence, Tucked within the shelves of the Vatican Archive are letters and petitions from monarchs who sought papal approval for their most controversial desires. Kings and queens appealed for annulments of marriages, dispensations for forbidden unions, and blessings for claims to thrones contested by rivals. Each letter reveals how rulers saw the Pope's word as a seal that could legitimize choices with eternal weight. Some begged with humility, presenting their pleas as matters of conscience. Others demanded with authority, reminding the Vatican of armies or alliances that could be turned against it. The responses, often recorded in detail, show the balancing act of the papacy, sometimes granting what was asked, sometimes refusing, and often negotiating terms that would benefit the Church. These exchanges remind us that the Vatican was not only a spiritual guide, but a political power that could make or break dynasties. They also reveal the vulnerability of rulers, for even the most powerful sought recognition from Rome to sanctify their actions. The secrecy around these documents reflects their sensitivity, as they expose the private struggles of monarchs whose public images depended on strength and certainty. To read them is to glimpse the intimate negotiations where faith, ambition, and personal desire converged, often shaping the destiny of nations. Preserved in silence, they remind us that the Vatican's authority extended far beyond sermons and sacraments. It reached into the very hearts of royal chambers, deciding not only the fate of souls but the course of kingdoms. Among the most fascinating treasures preserved in the Vatican Archive are accounts of early encounters with the New World. Missionaries, explorers, and envoys sent reports back to Rome describing lands across the ocean filled with unfamiliar plants, animals, and peoples. These letters often mingled wonder with judgment, marveling at the abundance of nature while condemning local beliefs as idolatry. Some writers praised the courage and hospitality of the communities they met, while others spoke of violence, conquest, and suffering. The Vatican received not only descriptions of landscapes and customs, but also samples of objects, ritual items, textiles, and even seeds, which were carefully catalogued and studied. These documents reveal the dual role of the Church in this age of discovery, as a recorder of human diversity and as a participant in the transformation of entire societies. They also show the tension between admiration and condemnation as missionaries struggled to reconcile what they saw with the teachings they carried. The secrecy around these reports is telling, for some accounts describe the brutality of colonizers and the devastation wrought by disease, details that clashed with the triumphant narrative of conversion. Preserved in silence, these manuscripts remind us that the Vatican witnessed the birth of a new global order, one that brought immense change, both wondrous and tragic. They remain locked away as testimony to first encounters that altered the course of history forever, not only for Europe, but for the countless peoples whose worlds were forever reshaped. Within the hidden shelves of the Vatican Archive lie manuscripts that trace the rise and suppression of secret societies, groups that once operated in the shadows yet drew the close attention of Rome. Among the most frequently mentioned are the Knights Templar, a powerful order of warrior monks accused of heresy, idolatry, and corruption. The trial records, preserved in careful detail, include confessions obtained under pressure, papal decrees dissolving the order, and accounts of property seized by both church and crown. Alongside the Templars are documents concerning the Freemasons, whose rituals and influence were condemned repeatedly by successive popes. These papers reveal the Vatican's deep suspicion of groups that blended ritual, secrecy, and independent power structures outside of papal control. Some records suggest genuine fear that such societies might undermine faith or manipulate politics, while others expose the rivalry for wealth and influence that fueled their downfall. Preserved in silence, these manuscripts show how the Church sought to maintain authority by dismantling organizations that threatened its supremacy, whether spiritual or worldly. They also highlight the enduring fascination such groups hold, for secrecy breeds legend, and the mere fact that their trials and condemnations remain locked in the Vatican's vaults keeps speculation alive. These documents remind us that power is never uncontested, and that the Vatican, while claiming to guard divine truth, also guarded its dominance fiercely, leaving behind a paper trail of suspicion and suppression that still whispers through history. Among the most mysterious documents said to rest within the Vatican Archive are accounts of relics, objects believed to carry divine power, whose origins are cloaked in uncertainty. The Church has long venerated relics, from fragments of the true cross to bones of apostles, but the archive preserves correspondence, inventories, and disputes over authenticity that reveal the complexity behind these sacred treasures. Some records describe the arrival of relics in Rome brought by crusaders or gifted by kings seeking papal favor. Others detail conflicts when multiple churches claimed possession of the same object, each insisting its relic was genuine. There are even documents in which doubts are raised by clerics themselves, questioning whether certain bones or cloths truly belonged to saints or whether they were crafted to inspire devotion and draw pilgrims. Yet the secrecy surrounding these manuscripts shows how carefully the Vatican guarded the image of certainty, even while acknowledging doubt behind closed doors. Relics were not only symbols of holiness, but also sources of immense influence, for they attracted pilgrims, donations, and prestige. By keeping the debates hidden, the Church ensured that faith in these objects remained unshaken. Preserved in silence, these records remind us that relics were both spiritual and political, shaping devotion while reinforcing the authority of those who claim to hold them. To study the archive is to glimpse the fragile balance between belief and skepticism, between sacred tradition and the human tendency to create symbols of power. Locked away, these relic documents show that faith often lives in tension with doubt, a truth the Vatican has long chosen to keep out of sight. Among the Vatican's hidden records are manuscripts concerning the darker arts of alchemy and early experiments that blended science, mysticism, and faith. Alchemy, long before it evolved into modern chemistry, was seen as both a search for material transformation and a spiritual journey. The archive preserves treatises written by clerics and scholars who sought to unlock the secrets of turning base metals into gold or discovering the elixir of life. Some of these texts draw heavily on Arabic and Greek sources, translated and preserved by monks who copy them with care. Others contain diagrams of furnaces, flasks, and elaborate processes that reveal a surprising depth of practical experimentation. Yet woven into these texts are prayers and invocations, showing how alchemy was often framed as a path to divine knowledge rather than simple greed. The secrecy surrounding these manuscripts reflects the Church's ambivalence. Alchemy could be viewed as dangerous, too close to forbidden knowledge. Yet it also offered insights into creation that aligned with the idea of uncovering God's mysteries. By preserving these works while keeping them hidden, the Vatican ensured that knowledge was not lost, but that its use remained tightly controlled. These writings reveal a time when faith and experiment were not always at odds, but walked uneasily side by side, with curiosity tempered by caution. Locked away in silence, they remind us that the pursuit of understanding has always carried risks, and that even the holiest institutions kept one eye on the promise of transformation, both material and spiritual. The Vatican Archive also contains records of banned and forbidden books, works that the Church once declared too dangerous for the faithful to read. For centuries, the index of prohibited books was enforced with great seriousness, guiding what could be printed, studied, or circulated within Catholic lands. The archive preserves copies of these censored texts alongside the papal decrees that condemned them. Some of these books were philosophical, questioning the nature of the universe in ways that challenged theology. Others were political, urging independence from clerical authority or criticizing the wealth of the papacy. Still others were scientific works that offered discoveries the Church considered threatening to faith. Marginal notes in the Vatican's own copies sometimes reveal the concerns of the censors, highlighting passages deemed especially dangerous. Yet the very act of preserving these books, rather than destroying them, demonstrates a paradox. Even as the Church forbade their reading, it recognized their importance. Locked in the archive, they survived, waiting in silence until the index itself was abandoned in more recent times. These records remind us that censorship was never only about silencing ideas, but about controlling who could access them and under what circumstances. The forbidden books show that knowledge has always carried both power and peril, and that the Vatican sought to guard not just the souls of believers, but also the narrative of truth itself. By keeping these works in secret rather than erasing them, the Church ensured that even dangerous ideas could endure, though only behind locked doors. Within the Vatican's hidden vaults are manuscripts tied to prophecies, visions, and apocalyptic warnings that circulated through Europe across the centuries. Some are the writings of mystics who claim to see into the future, recording dreams of wars, famine, and the end of days. Others are papal records of how such visions were received, weighed carefully to determine whether they came from divine inspiration or dangerous delusion. The archive preserves letters from visionaries who wrote to the Holy See with urgent messages, convinced that heaven itself had spoken through them. Some prophecies were quietly dismissed, others investigated, and a few taken so seriously that they shaped papal policy. Among these texts are predictions that eerily align with events that followed, while others read like desperate poetry born from times of fear. The secrecy surrounding these manuscripts reflects the Vatican's caution, for to share too freely would risk stirring panic or giving authority to voices outside its control. Yet, their preservation suggests that the Church, even in its skepticism, could not wholly disregard them. These writings reveal a world where the line between revelation and madness was fragile, and where leaders of faith feared both ignoring a true warning and embracing a false one. Locked away, the prophecies remain silent, their words suspended in uncertainty, reminding us that even the greatest institutions of faith have long wrestled with the mystery of what the future may hold. The Vatican Archive also safeguards records of schisms within the Church, moments when unity fractured and rival popes claimed the throne of St. Peter. Among the most dramatic was the Western Schism, when different factions of cardinals elected competing pontiffs in Rome and Avignon, each insisting he was the rightful leader of Christendom. The archive preserves letters of accusation and defense, papal bulls denouncing opponents as impostors, and appeals from kings and emperors choosing sides. These documents show how deeply political loyalty intertwined with faith, for entire kingdoms followed one pope while condemning another, splitting Europe into rival camps. The manuscripts also contain evidence of the human toll confusion among the faithful, conflicting decrees about sacraments, and doubts about whether baptisms or marriages performed under one authority were valid. The secrecy surrounding these records reflects the Vatican's desire to present the papacy as an unbroken chain of legitimacy, when in reality it was at times bitterly contested. Preserved in silence, these manuscripts reveal that the papal office, often portrayed as a divine certainty, was also vulnerable to ambition, pressure, and the tides of politics. They remind us that unity was not always given but fought for, and that even the holiest office in Christendom was shaped by conflict and compromise. To read them is to glimpse a time when the Church itself seemed divided beyond repair, a fragile institution held together only by the hope that truth would eventually prevail over power. Among the many records preserved in the Vatican's vaults are those documenting the long and often uneasy relationship between the papacy and the Jewish people. These documents include papal bulls that restricted where Jewish communities could live, imposed distinctive dress, or forbade certain trades. Alongside them are letters from rulers requesting guidance on how to govern Jewish subjects, as well as petitions from Jewish leaders pleading for protection against violence or unjust taxation. Some records reveal moments of compassion, when popes intervened to shield communities from persecution, while others expose harsh decrees that reinforce prejudice and isolation. The archive also holds accounts of conversions, both voluntary and forced, recorded with careful detail as evidence of souls brought into the Church. Yet hidden in these documents is the story of resilience, for Jewish communities continued to endure despite centuries of pressure. The secrecy surrounding these manuscripts reflects the Church's awareness of the pain and controversy they contain, for they tell a history that cannot be easily reconciled with its message of mercy. Preserved in silence, these records remind us that the Vatican was both a source of authority and a mirror of its times, shaped by fear, politics, and power as much as by faith. To read them is to confront the contradictions of an institution that could offer sanctuary with one hand and impose restrictions with the other, leaving a legacy of struggle that still echoes across history. Rest your mind, you've earned it. But when the next veil lifts, be here. Subscribe. Hidden within the Vatican Archive are records that shed light on the Reformation, the great fracture that reshaped Christianity in Europe. These documents include letters from Martin, Luther's earliest critics, papal bulls condemning his writings, and reports from envoys who tracked the rapid spread of his ideas. The archive preserves debates between Catholic theologians and reformers, arguments over indulgences, authority, and the very nature of salvation. Some manuscripts reveal the anxiety of the papacy as entire kingdoms shifted their loyalty, while others show the Vatican's determination to preserve unity through both persuasion and force. There are also accounts of meetings with princes who sought compromise, negotiations that often collapsed into deeper divisions. To read these documents is to feel the weight of a church caught between defending tradition and confronting a movement too powerful to silence. The secrecy surrounding many of these papers reflects the Vatican's discomfort with exposing how uncertain and chaotic those years truly were. They show that the Reformation was not a single clean break, but a turbulent process filled with doubt, fear, and competing visions of truth. Preserved in silence, these records reveal not only the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, but also the struggle within the Vatican itself to understand and respond to a challenge unlike any it had faced before. They remain as testimony to the fragility of unity, the power of words to ignite transformation, and the enduring tension between authority and conscience. Among the more sensitive collections preserved in the Vatican Archive are the records of papal involvement in wars, alliances, and the shifting politics of Europe. Far from being only spiritual shepherds, many popes acted as statesmen and military leaders, commanding armies, forging treaties, and waging conflicts in defense of their temporal power. The archive contains letters exchanged with kings and emperors, detailing negotiations for military support or truces carefully balanced against rival claims. Some manuscripts describe papal blessings bestowed on campaigns, granting a sacred aura to wars that were often rooted in worldly ambition. Others reveal the Vatican's efforts to mediate peace when conflicts threatened to engulf Christian unity, though not always successfully. These records expose the dual nature of the papacy, at once spiritual authority and political power, struggling to reconcile the cross with the sword. The secrecy around such documents is unsurprising, for they reveal how closely the Vatican's history is tied to bloodshed and ambition, truths that sit uneasily alongside its message of peace. Yet the preservation of these manuscripts also reflects an acknowledgement that power is always complicated, and that the Church, like kingdoms and empires, was deeply enmeshed in the struggles of its age. To read them is to understand that the Vatican was not merely a silent witness to history, but an active participant in its shaping, wielding both prayer and politics with equal intensity. The Vatican Archive also preserves documents connected to espionage, for information was as powerful as armies or wealth. Across the centuries, the papacy relied on networks of informants, nuncios, confessors, and agents who gathered intelligence in courts and cities across Europe. Their reports, sent back to Rome, offered details of alliances, betrayals, and secret negotiations. Some letters read like careful political analysis, noting shifts in loyalty or the weaknesses of rulers. Others resemble spycraft, recording intercepted messages or whisperings overheard in corridors of power. The archive contains accounts of secret missions carried out under papal orders, often cloaked as diplomatic visits or religious journeys. These documents reveal how the Vatican balanced its spiritual image with a very worldly need to know what enemies and allies were planning. The secrecy around these manuscripts is natural, for they expose the Church not as a passive observer, but as an active player in intelligence gathering, using knowledge to secure advantage. Preserved in silence, they show that even an institution devoted to faith understood that survival depended on foresight. To read them is to see the Vatican as not only a guardian of doctrine, but a shadowy presence in the great game of politics, where information was guarded, traded, and sometimes weaponized. These records remind us that history is shaped not only by open decrees and wars, but by the unseen flow of secrets, many of which remain locked away within the walls of Rome. In the hidden recesses of the Vatican Archive lie records of art and patronage, showing how the papacy shaped culture as much as it guided faith. These documents include contracts with painters, sculptors, and architects, detailing the commissions that transformed Rome into a city of splendor. Letters between popes and artists reveal negotiations over fees, deadlines, and materials, reminding us that even masterpieces like frescoes and cathedrals were the products of careful planning and financial strain. Some manuscripts describe the rivalry between patrons, as successive pontiffs sought to outdo their predecessors by leaving behind ever grander monuments. Others record the tensions between creative vision and theological oversight, when artists pushed boundaries of form or subject that troubled the Church's guardians of orthodoxy. Preserved with equal care are inventories of artworks collected, purchased, or gifted, showing the Vatican as a custodian of beauty as well as doctrine. Yet secrecy also surrounds some of these records, particularly those revealing the immense sums spent on art, while ordinary believers struggled in poverty. The archive thus exposes the paradox of a church that preached humility while commissioning wonders of stone, paint, and gold. These documents remind us that art was not only devotion made visible, but also a declaration of power, designed to awe and inspire as much as to teach. Locked away, they tell the story of how faith and ambition intertwined on canvas and in marble, shaping a legacy of beauty that still defines the Vatican today. The Vatican Archive also contains manuscripts tied to astronomy and the calendar, records that reveal how the Church measured time itself. Among these are the documents of the Gregorian Reform, when scholars and clerics worked to correct errors in the Julian calendar that has slowly drifted from the movements of the sun. The archive preserves letters from astronomers who calculated the equinox with remarkable precision, as well as papal decrees that established the new system still in use today. Other texts describe the debates that surrounded the reform, for while many embraced the change, some kingdoms resisted, unwilling to adopt a calendar tied so closely to papal authority. Beyond this reform, the manuscripts also record observations of eclipses, star positions, and celestial cycles, showing that the Vatican was deeply engaged in understanding the heavens. Yet, secrecy veiled much of this work, particularly when discoveries raised questions that brushed too closely against Scripture. To preserve these writings while restricting access allowed the Church to control the narrative of science, presenting harmony while keeping tension hidden. These documents remind us that the measurement of time was never only a matter of astronomy, but also of power, for whoever controlled the calendar shaped the rhythm of worship, harvests, and governance. Locked within the archive, these manuscripts reveal the Vatican's role in both guiding and restraining the pursuit of cosmic order, balancing faith with the demands of accuracy in a universe that refused to stand still. Preserved within the Vatican's archive are secret correspondences with explorers who pushed into unknown seas and distant lands. These letters reveal not only the marvels they encountered, but also the instructions given by Rome, urging them to spread the faith alongside the flag of empire. Reports describe vast coastlines, unfamiliar peoples, and resources that would reshape Europe's fortunes. Some documents capture awe at new discoveries, while others record the violence and exploitation that followed in the wake of conquest. The archive also holds papal decrees that divided entire continents between European powers, decisions made with pen and seal that changed the fate of millions. These manuscripts remind us that the Vatican was a participant in the great age of exploration, shaping how new worlds were understood and claimed. Yet secrecy veils much of this history, for within the glowing reports of conversions lie darker accounts of suffering, disease, and enslavement. By preserving these documents but keeping them hidden, the Vatican ensured that its role in the age of discovery would be remembered only in fragments, never in full. They revealed the paradox of a church that sought to bring faith to distant shores, while also blessing the ambitions of kings hungry for land and wealth. Locked in silence, these manuscripts remain as witnesses to encounters that transformed the world, encounters where belief, curiosity, and conquest were inseparably bound. Within the Secret Archive are also records of heresy trials that shaped the intellectual and spiritual life of Europe. These documents include charges brought against theologians, mystics, and thinkers whose writings or teachings strayed from official doctrine. Some of the accused argued for interpretations of Scripture that challenged papal authority, while others explored ideas about the nature of the soul, salvation, or free will that unsettled the guardians of orthodoxy. The manuscripts preserve the questions asked by inquisitors, the answers given by the accused, and the judgments that followed, ranging from penance to excommunication. In some cases, entire libraries were seized, their contents examined line by line for signs of error. The secrecy surrounding these records reflects the Vatican's struggle to maintain control over thought itself, for heresy was not simply a crime against belief, but a challenge to the unity of the Church. Preserved in silence, these trial accounts reveal how fragile that unity often was, shaken by individuals whose ideas refused to fit within rigid boundaries. Yet they also show the resilience of human inquiry, for even in the face of condemnation, voices continue to question, argue, and dream. To read these manuscripts is to witness the clash between authority and conscience, a struggle that shaped not only theology but the very idea of freedom of thought. Locked away, they remain a testimony to both the fear of dissent and the courage of those who dared to speak differently. Discussed openly, the manuscripts include transcripts of arguments over doctrine, reports on the state of Christendom, and strategies for navigating conflicts with monarchs and rival powers. Some accounts reveal deep divisions within the Church itself, with factions clashing over authority, reform, or the handling of scandals. Others show moments of unity, when leaders came together to protect the institution in the face of external threat. The secrecy of these councils was deliberate, for the Vatican understood that public exposure of internal struggles could weaken its image of certainty. Yet the preservation of these records ensures that the debates were not forgotten, even if they were never meant to be seen. To read them is to step into rooms heavy with tension, where decisions made in whispers could alter the course of nations. These documents remind us that the image of the Church as a monolithic force was carefully constructed, while beneath it lay the same disagreements, fears, and ambitions that shape any human institution. Locked away, the secret councils live on in parchment and ink, silent witnesses to the fragile balance between faith and power. In the hidden vaults of the Vatican lie correspondences with scientists whose discoveries challenged long-held interpretations of Scripture. Among the most striking are documents connected to Galileo, whose defense of a sun-centered cosmos brought him into direct conflict with church authority. The archive preserves transcripts of his trial, his letters to friends and patrons, and the cautious judgments of clerics who feared that new knowledge might unravel established teaching. Alongside Galileo are records of other thinkers, some less well known, who wrestled with questions about the movement of the stars, the nature of the earth, and the workings of the human body. These documents reveal both resistance and curiosity within the Vatican, For while some denounced new theories as dangerous, others quietly studied them, recognizing their brilliance even as they hesitated to admit it publicly. The secrecy around these manuscripts reflects the delicate balance the Church tried to hold, preserving knowledge while controlling how it could be discussed. By locking away such records, the Vatican ensured that discoveries survived, even if they were not yet accepted. They remind us that progress often moves in silence, waiting for the moment when ideas too bold for their own time can be embraced. Preserved within the archive, these manuscripts testify to the tension between belief and inquiry, a struggle that shaped the path of science and faith alike. At the heart of the Vatican Secret Archive lies its greatest mystery: why so much knowledge has been preserved yet hidden from the world. The manuscripts span centuries, covering theology, politics, science, and human suffering, yet they remain locked away where only a few may read them. Some argue this secrecy protects the faithful from confusion, while others believe it shields the Church from scrutiny. Whatever the reason, the archive stands as both a treasure and a burden, a vast storehouse of memory that holds the light of wisdom and the shadow of power. These documents remind us that history is never simple. It is written in triumphs and failures, in compassion and cruelty, in moments of faith and acts of fear. The archive does not merely preserve the past, it preserves the choices of those who decided what should be remembered and what should be concealed. Locked behind guarded doors, it continues to fascinate because it embodies the paradox of human history itself: our desire to know and our fear of what knowing might bring. To imagine walking its aisles is to feel the weight of centuries pressing in silence, a silence that speaks louder than any words. And though most of us will never see its secrets firsthand, the very knowledge that they exist calls us to wonder what truths still sleep in the darkness, waiting for the courage of a new age to bring them into the light. That was one layer. Take a moment, then subscribe, and we'll go deeper next time.